We are talking about Frantz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth today. And I wanted to talk about three things. First is I wanted to give a brief introduction to who Frantz Fanon was and what his political theory is all about. The second thing I want to talk about is the two major concepts in Fanon's thought: colonization and decolonization. And as you can see here, these are very tightly linked concepts. They come together. Third thing I want to talk about is Fanon's rather controversial claim, and this is the claim he's often remembered most for, I would say, unfortunately, because there's a lot of other insightful theoretical work in Fanon, but he's mostly remembered for this argument that decolonization is always violent. And so I want to talk about not only what does decolonization mean, but what is its character such that it always eventuates in some kind of, quote, violence. Okay. First things first, introduction to Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon lived in the middle of the 20th century as a polymath of sorts. And polymath just means he was pretty good, very good, at doing a variety of things. He had a variety of expertise. Frantz Fanon was trained as a medical doctor and a practicing psychiatrist. He was not trained as a philosopher, but he had a deep philosophical background. And indeed, he's become a major figure in what's called Africana philosophy. African diasporic philosophy is another way of putting that, if you haven't heard that term Africana before. And Frantz Fanon was also a practicing revolutionary. Let's get into this story in a little bit more detail. Frantz Fanon is from Martinique. Martinique, at the time of Fanon's birth, was a French colony in the Caribbean. So this is general knowledge, but it wouldn't hurt to make sure we're all on the same page. So the Caribbean is an island chain in the Caribbean Sea. It stretches, if you want to talk about it in continental terms, basically from the south of Miami to the north of Venezuela. And what you'll see here is you've got Spanish-speaking countries in the Caribbean, like Dominican Republic. You've got English-speaking countries like Jamaica. And then you've got French-speaking countries like Martinique or Guadeloupe. Okay, and these are all these languages, and the widespread usage of these languages in these islands is a direct result of colonization. The fact that the Caribbean can be divided linguistically in this way is a result of the fact that various European powers colonized these islands. So Fanon, at the time, was living in a French colony called Martinique. These days, Martinique has acquired the status of what the French call overseas department. And the legal status there is a little different, but you can see here that the roots of this overseas department category are in French colonialism. Okay, so at the time, France considered all of its overseas colonies to be a part of France. France considered the colonial subjects, the people who lived in these overseas colonies, to be part of France. Okay, so Fanon notes that in Martinique, there was a kind of irony going on because, for example, in French schools, young boys like Fanon, who is phenotypically black, of African descent, they would be learning in the textbooks, in French, of course, about, quote, our ancestors, the Gauls, end quote. Now, our ancestors, the Gauls, doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the case of Fanon, because the Gauls were this tribe of ancient European peoples. Okay, so there's an irony here. And there were further ironies in Fanon's lived experience. You know, when Fanon fought in World War II, he was very eager, of course, to get out there and fight the Germans. He was very eager to go fight the fascists. And he fought on behalf of France, like many French colonial subjects did. But the irony, of course, is that what did Germany actually want to do? Germany wanted to basically colonize the rest of Europe. Okay, you know, and in Fanon's mind, isn't that kind of what France was doing to huge parts of the world? In the so-called West Indies, in North Africa, in Southeast Asia? Okay, so there's some irony here. There's this kind of disjunction, this kind of dissonance in Fanon's own experience. And Fanon's experience of irony didn't end when, after the war, he went to study in Lyon. This is in France. He was studying to become a psychiatrist. Back then, you had to get a medical degree, and that's what Fanon was doing. And, you know, he had learned from a young age, oh, I'm French, my ancestors, the Gauls, and all this. But people in France were clearly uncomfortable around black people. And he would be stopped in the street, and little kids would point and stare. Okay, so once again, there is a dissonance between the official ideology, hey, we're all French. It doesn't matter if you're from overseas parts of the French Empire or whether you're in Lyon or Paris and somewhere in France proper. We're all French. But then in the experience, there's the dissonance where clearly some people are more French than others, and clearly some people are more respected than others. Okay, and then when Fanon graduates with a medical degree, he's a practicing psychiatrist. He is assigned to a hospital in Blida, Joinville. This is in Algeria. This is outside of Algiers, one of the main cities in Algeria. He starts seeing commonalities between his own experience as a Martinican and the Algerians' experience of being French colonial subjects. And what he's seeing is there are these kinds of solidarities between Caribbean people and North African people, at least insofar as they are both subjects to the French Empire. And at the time, Algeria was fighting for its independence from France. Algeria wanted to become an independent nation state on equal footing with France, Germany, England, or whatever, any of the European powers. And in that independence movement, you had a variety of basically revolutionary organizations. And one of these was the FLN, in French, Front Libération Nationale, which basically means in English, National Liberation Front. And Fanon joined the FLN. So he, in a way, through politics, he became Algerian. By participating in the Algerian War for Independence, the Algerian Revolution, he kind of committed himself to the fate, the destiny of Algeria. And in a way, not by birth, but by commitment, became an Algerian. Okay, so that's Fanon's life story. Fanon's influence has been widely felt in many parts of the world. So the preface to our Grove edition, it's written by Homi Bhabha. He's a scholar of colonialism. He mentions that Fanon's influence has been felt in very far-flung places. So, for example, in South Africa, when black students were organizing against apartheid. Apartheid is roughly, and only roughly, the equivalent to what in the United States we call segregation. They were reading Frantz Fanon. In Ireland, revolutionary groups that did not accept that any part of Ireland should be a part of the United Kingdom the Irish Republican Army, the more radical factions of that, for example, they were reading Frantz Fanon. In Iran, when revolutionaries who were trying to combine Islam and anti-colonialism to overthrow the Shah in the 1970s, these Iranian revolutionaries, they were reading Frantz Fanon. And in the United States, in the 1960s, in the 1970s, after the Civil Rights Movement, when certain groups within Black movement activism were becoming radicalized, Baba mentions the Black Panther Party. They were reading Frantz Fanon. So what's the common denominator here? Common denominator is Frantz Fanon's influence has been most strongly felt among peoples who understand their situation to be one of colonized people. Okay, and we'll talk about Fanon's notion of colonization in a second, but that's the basic gist. Okay. Fanon is our second to last author. Hannah Arendt is our final author. And so we're in part 3 of the course, and part 3 of the course is leading to essay number 3. And the common denominator, the common thread between Fanon and Arendt's political theory is revolution is the main deal. Revolution in the post-World War II period. Okay. Now, I know some of you are thinking, didn't we just talk about this with Wollstonecraft and Marx? Revolution was a big term for them, too. Yes and no. I mean, for Wollstonecraft and Marx, the big idea is, what is the shape of overall human history? And of course, these various stages or phases are marked by revolutions. So for Wollstonecraft, there's the before the French Revolution, and then there's an after the French Revolution. There's a before the revolution in female manners, and then there's an after the revolution in female manners. Same difference with Marx, with this socialist revolution. There's the before the socialist revolution, capitalism. There's the after the socialist revolution, communism. Okay, so revolution was not the main deal. It was the transition between eras. For Frantz Fanon and Hannah Arendt, revolution is the main deal. Their books are entirely about that revolutionary period. Their books are entirely about what's going to happen in the revolutionary period, what's the aim of it, how is the revolution conducted, and so forth. Okay, the major difference is Fanon is writing from, and I'm using contemporary terms, Fanon is writing from the perspective of the global South. And his big idea of revolution is centered on colonialism. Hannah Arendt, our final author of the course, is writing from the perspective of global North. And her conception of revolution is centered on constitutionalism. Okay, and we'll get to Arendt's notion of what a constitution is. But for now, let's talk about Fanon's notion of colonialism. Okay, so if you look up colonialism in any, standard dictionary or online Google search and so forth, what you'll see is the basic definition is something like one country or one people exercising political domination or political control over another people or another country. So it's one country controlling another country, if you want to think of it in most simple terms. The kind of thing Frantz Fanon was talking about was a little more specific. He was talking about settler colonialism. So what happened between France and Algeria? Prior to the 1830s, Algeria was actually part of another empire. It was known as the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was centered in Turkey. Okay, but the French invade Algeria. They have a war of conquest, basically, and then they take control of that territory, and that establishes the claim, the sovereignty of France over Algeria, and that is at the foundation of the French claim that Algeria is French Algeria, and that Algeria is part of France, and that the people on that territory, the quote, native people, the indigenous people to that land, the people who were there before the French got there, basically, they were now subject to French government, French laws, and French colonial society. And the reason this is a little more specific than the dictionary definition is that French people started to settle in Algeria. So, for example, Algeria was considered by many French, middle class and lower class, to be a great site of economic opportunity. So say you're a working class person in France, people would go to Algeria in search for opportunity. Maybe they could own a cafe or a small business in Algiers, one of the big cities in Algeria. Maybe they could own some land and build up a farm and become a great landowner. Okay, and maybe a lot of French people looked at Algeria in the same way that a lot of Americans in the 19th century looked at the West, as a place where land was plentiful and where there were many opportunities, and yes, where there were, quote, natives out there, out West, that would sometimes have to be fought, sometimes you have to take the land from them, and sometimes you can trade with them and do economic activities with them. So Algeria functioned for France in the 19th century, much like the out West did for US Americans. Okay, so settler colonization was happening. France made Algeria into a settler colony because the colonization happened through settlement, through putting French people in Algeria and building up a society there. Okay, so that's one thing that makes Frantz Fanon's notion of colonization a little more specific, that there's settlement involved. Here's another thing that makes Frantz Fanon's notion of colonization pretty specific. What Frantz Fanon has got is basically this model of colonial society. And he's not talking only about Algeria, but he's most acquainted with Algeria. And he's not only talking about Africa. You'll see he talks, for example, about colonization, European colonization in Asia, but he's mostly talking about Africa. Okay, and what does Fanon think is being set up by the colonial powers in, for example, North Africa? He's saying they're setting up a colonial society. How can we tell when we've got a colonial society? Frantz Fanon says these kinds of societies are split in a Manichaean way. Manichaeanism is an ancient religion. It's a syncretic religion. It's all mixed up. But the basic idea of Manichaeanism is that the worlds, what appears to be one world, is actually two worlds. And these worlds are at odds with one another. They are antagonistic forces. And one world is a world of light, and the other world is a world of darkness. One world is a world of absolute good, and absolute good excludes absolute evil. The worlds mutually exclude one another. That's the language that Frantz Fanon uses. So there's a Manichaean divide. There's this antagonistic binary divide. And what appears to be one society, this colonial society, is actually split in two. And then Fanon wants to lay out three dimensions of this split. The first dimension is space. Space. And Fanon says colonial space is divided into, say, European quarters and native quarters. In Algeria, you had French quarters, and then you had what were called Arab quarters. In Algeria, you had the European section of town, and then you had what was called Casbah. That's spelled Casbah. It's derived from the Arabic word for citadel. Okay, and I've got some pictures here from a movie. I'm going to show some clips from this in a second, but this is Algiers, and here is the downtown and the industrialized part. You can see here straight lines, wide roads, electricity marked by these evenly spaced, what are those called? Lampposts. You've got the grid, you've got a city grid, you've got multi-story buildings. Okay, so that's gives you some sense of the European part of town. And now let's take a look at Casbah. Okay, you can see here, you don't have the grid. You don't have the straight lines. The buildings are less tall, and you can tell this evolved kind of naturally and organically and historically over many, many centuries. Whereas, you know, that other stuff, the French stuff, that was only there at the time of the Algerian Revolution, some 120, 130 years. Okay, and instead of these electric lights and straight roads, you can see we've got clothes hanging out on, are those clothes? Are those rugs? I'm not sure. We've got something hanging out to dry on these lines. And we've basically got less wealth, less, as it was called back then, modernization, less industrialization. Okay, and Fanon's point is these two parts of town are divided from one another by brute force. They're divided by brute force. You can think about this as, you know, for example, like a segregated society or an apartheid society. It's the police and the military, ultimately, that police the boundary between the different kinds of spaces where different kinds of people live. Okay, so brute force divides the colonial space. And this spatial division is layered on top of a racial division. So when you see Fanon talking about colonial society being split into two species, Fanon is obviously being ironic, but Fanon is also referring to colonial ideas that the Europeans and the Arab populations were of two different kinds. That's really all species means. And the idea among the colonialists, the colonizers, as well as the idea amongst the colonized, really, if we're going to be frank, is that these differences aren't just cultural. It's not just a difference of, say, Christianity or secularism versus Islam and secularism from Islam. It's not just a difference of speaking French versus Arabic. It's a difference of biology. There was, at the time, a great deal of what we would now call pseudoscientific race science. And the idea is, you know, the brains of Europeans are different than the brains of Arab peoples, that the physiology and the sort of genetic structure were somehow fundamentally different, a difference of kind, instead of variations within the same species of degree. Okay, so the idea was there was a biological difference between these populations. And once again, biological divisions to be policed, borders between populations to be maintained by what? Well, like everything else in this colonial society, by brutal force. And then the final way that Fanon wants to talk about colonial society being split into two with these two sides antagonistic to one another, with these two sides excluding one another, is in terms of class. So Fanon, in one of the most, today, one of the most famous passages of The Wretched of the Earth, he says that class division and race division in the colonial society support one another. You can't reduce class division to racial division. Likewise, you cannot reduce racial division to class division, but you have to see that class and race are always tied up with one another in a society like Algeria, in a colonized society. And so on page 5, Fanon says, I'm in about the middle of the page if you've got the Grove and want to follow along, looking at the immediacies of the colonial context, it is clear that what divides the world is first and foremost what species, what race one belongs to. So now we're talking about the race ideas, and this kind of people, the native people, live over here, and this other kind of people, the settlers, they live over here. Fanon continues, in the colonies, the economic infrastructure is also a superstructure. So remember, this was this old Marxist idea that what is at the foundation of any social order is the economic base. For Marx, that meant the means of production. You remember that jargon, the means of production and the class relations. That's at the base. And Marx claimed that everything else is a kind of infrastructure built on top, a superstructure built on top of that infrastructure, that economic base. Included amongst the infrastructure were culture, ideology, politics, political parties. All of that was built on top of the base of economics. Okay, now look how Fanon is trying to challenge this idea. Because these cultural ideas about race, for example, the idea that humans are divided into species rather than belonging to the same species, that's not just superstructure. That's not just on the surface. That is in the deep structure, Fanon is saying. That is in the infrastructure of a colonial society. And here's how Fanon puts this point. In the colonies, the infrastructure is also a superstructure. The cause is also the effect. You are rich because you are white. You are white because you are rich. So in the ideal colonial situation, let's call it ideal because obviously in reality things are never this clear. In reality, you can't maintain this kind of Manichaean or binary divide. It just doesn't, it doesn't really work. But here's the ideal. The ideal is all whites will be richer than all, well, it depends on what country you're in, non-whites, let's put it like that. All whites will enjoy a superior social status, and now we're talking beyond wealth. We're talking about cultural respect, recognition, all that, opportunities, etc. All whites will enjoy a superior status to all non-whites. Okay, and this is how race and class are tied up with one another. And this is why situations like this, you're rich because you're white because you're rich, situations like this is why, Fanon says, Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched when it comes to addressing the colonial issue. We'll come back to this claim that Fanon has about Marxism in a later lecture, but what he's saying is you can't just take Marxism, which is a European theory, which is grounded in European social conditions, which is grounded in European history, and then willy-nilly export it to European colonies and think that, for example, the class analysis is just going to work in the same way, because it won't, Fanon is saying. If Marx thought that colonialism was an outgrowth of capitalism, and Marx thought that capitalism was the main thing, and the only reason that you had colonies to begin with is because colonialism is a part of capitalism. Fanon is going to try and reverse our perspective. Fanon is going to say the main thing is colonization, and the main concept is colonial society. And you should see class relations, you should see capitalism as a part of colonialism. So if Marx says colonialism is an outgrowth and a part of capitalism, Fanon's going to flip it around. In fact, capitalism is a part and an outgrowth of colonialism. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about colonization. Colonization is what leads to a colonial society, and then we defined the colonial society in 3 ways. What is decolonization? Well, decolonization, in the broadest sense, and this is not specific to Fanon, it's the undoing of colonization. So one meaning of D is to take out, to remove. So that's the meaning of D, that prefix. For example, when you talk about dehumidifying, you take out the water. Okay, you make the air a little drier. Okay, so decolonization, again, this is an analogy, it's nothing strict. Decolonization means taking the colonialism, taking that Manichaean divide, that binary antagonism, taking that out of your society. It doesn't, so Fanon thinks that you can take a colonial society and you can decolonize it and turn it into a society after colonialism. You could call that a post-colonial society, although that's not what Frantz Fanon calls it. But if there's a successful decolonization process, what you will have removed is this kind of society, the colonial society split into 2. Okay, so that's a general notion of decolonization. A little more specific, and now we're moving a little closer to Fanon, is decolonization means, you remember those countries that were taken over by other countries and were basically being politically dominated by them. Okay, those countries are going to become independent and equal to the colonizing countries. In other words, the colonial relationship, the unequal and the uneven relationship between the colonizer and the colonized will be leveled. Okay, so instead of Algeria being part of some other huge empire, be it Ottoman or French, Algeria will then become an independent nation state. And we'll talk more about Fanon's relationship to the nation as a political form and to nationalism. Okay, but definitely what Fanon, what the whole FLN, this revolutionary group he was a part of, wanted was an independent Algeria. An Algeria that, as it were, stood on its own 2 feet rather than stood in relation of dependence to France. Okay, so now we're moving closer to Fanon. Let's move even closer to Fanon, because what Fanon says in this first chapter is decolonization is a process. If colonization was a process, decolonization is also a process. Because Fanon is most interested in decolonization, that's his idea of revolutionary politics, he wants to show us the various phases and the various stages of this process. Okay, so Fanon isn't going to give us a full picture of human history, and here's the grand scope of human history. That was Marx and Engels. But within the revolution itself, he's going to talk about stages and phases. Okay, Fanon says decolonization starts with a very simple idea of replacement. And replacement means literally taking the place of. Now, who is going to take the place of what? Fanon says at the very beginning, in this sort of least developed form, in its simplest form, decolonization simply means the native population wants to take the place of this foreign population. The indigenous people want to take the place of the settlers. Why? Because as we just saw, they live in the fancier buildings. And as we know from a variety of colonial societies, the settlers, they have more political power, more political representation. And as we know from a variety of colonial societies, not just Algeria, they happen to be wealthier and enjoy a higher social status and have more socioeconomic opportunities. Okay, so that's the initial idea. You just throw the foreigners out, and then you take over the positions that they once occupied. And Fanon says, look, I understand that's the idea, and I understand where it's coming from, but that is a very simplistic idea. And Fanon is later, as he talks about the development of colonization and the maturation of colonization and this growing sophistication of the decolonization movement, Fanon is going to say that simple idea has to be discarded. So this idea that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, he's quoting from scripture here, but this idea of just like reversing things, that's where decolonization starts, but that's not where it ends. Where does it end? Well, we're going to pass through a variety of phases, but ultimately what Fanon is pointing to is the idea that, and now this is a big story about the big destiny of humanity and so forth. What Fanon is saying is there was a period in human history where basically Europe was on top, and Europe could more or less control huge swaths of the world. And let's call that the era of European dominance or European global colonialism, whatever you want to call it. And he's saying that corresponded to a particular phase in the history of humanity. And what Fanon is seeing after World War II with, for example, a great variety of African countries coming into independence, he's seeing the end of that era. And what Fanon wants to know is what's next? What's next? So he gestures, he doesn't tell us what's on the other side of this era, but he gestures towards what he calls a new humanity. Okay, so let's get into this story, the initial stages of decolonization process. Fanon says, where does this idea of replacement come from? I want to live in a big house like the colonizer. I want to drive a fancy car like the colonizer. I want to own a lot of land like the colonizer and so forth. Well, Fanon says it's very simple. It comes from a place of envy. It comes from a place of envy. And remember, Fanon is a psychiatrist. And he worked in Algeria, and he worked his patients, his subjects, his psychiatric subjects. Some of them were French, some of them were Algerian. He talked to all sorts. And what he said is, look, the colonized subjects, they envy the colonizer. And you can understand why. It's because the colonized are in a situation of deprivation. They feel they have been deprived of something. They've been deprived of the land. They've been deprived of wealth. They've been deprived of opportunity. They've just been deprived across the board. They have this feeling of deprivation, and from that feeling of deprivation comes envy, and the desire to be like the one and to take the things from the one you feel has deprived you. Okay, so that's in the very beginning. But Fanon says it doesn't stop there. If all the colonized ever felt were resentment and envy and jealousy, the decolonization movement would go nowhere. Because what Fanon says, and you got to remember, back in the 1950s and the 1960s, psychiatrists were really into analyzing dreams. And they were really into analyzing cultural practices and so forth. Today, we've got a much more kind of biological orientation towards psychiatry. Has much more to do with, neurochemistry and prescribing drugs and so forth. But back then, psychiatry was actually a lot more closely aligned with what maybe we call it cultural studies and dream analysis and things like that. So anyways, Fanon noticed that his colonized patients were often dreaming of movement. Now, why was it, as Fanon puts it, that the colonized subject from sundown to sunup is always, in his dreams, running through fields and leaping over rivers and just flying and just all this freedom of movement? Fanon says, well, it's very simple. It's very simple. It's because in reality, there are these checkpoints between the native quarters and settler quarters, and there's some French guy with a machine gun saying, where's your pass? Where's your pass? You want to come into the European part of town? Where's your pass? Okay, and that's the very opposite of freedom of movement. And so what do these dreams mean? Well, they mean that the colonized person is still dreaming of freedom, still has a desire to be free, to be liberated from this colonial society, which is limiting his freedom of movement, and in that way oppressing him. And it's the same difference when Fanon says there is, right before colonization, decolonization really kicks off. You notice how there's always a resurgence of interest in traditional practices, traditional dances, traditional myths. Myth here just means stories. Myth is the Greek word for story, mythos. Why is there this interest in all this colonial, this pre-colonial culture? Well, Fanon says it's a kind of refuge. It's kind of refuge because, first of all, the colonists came to Algeria or Vietnam or wherever he arrived, and he says, you all don't really have a culture. You're a bunch of savages. You are of an inferior scale of civilization, and you should do your best, and you'll never learn as well as us, but you should do your best to learn French and to study the French classics and French philosophy and French art and all that. Okay, and so it's a kind of rebellion. It's a kind of rebellion, Fanon thinks, to take refuge in these myths, in this music, in these dances. And then Fanon is saying there is still this desire to somehow be free from the colonizer, okay? Because in the pre-colonial era, this was before the French or whoever the Europeans was arrived. And so once again, it's expressing a desire to be free from this oppressive colonial society. How does the psyche, how does the political psychology of the colonized develop? Well, pretty soon, it's not taking flight into dreams or taking refuge in the past. Pretty soon, the colonized, Fanon says, is going to engage in a sober way, in a realistic way, with what's right in front of him, with his daily reality. And so the idea is that the colonized will come to reinterpret and to reframe the colonizers' symbols and practices. So one idea here is Fanon mentions the example of a siren. A siren. Fanon says prior to the decolonization process, when a colonized person hears a siren, say of the police force, they freeze in place. And why? Because in a colonial society, the police are meant to keep people in their place. Okay? And so Fanon says there's this kind of muscular tension and a kind of petrified fear, petrified being stone-like. Okay? But Fanon says at a certain point in the development of a colonial society, the colonized people who are in opposition to that society, when they hear the siren, they think to themselves, get ready to act. And so the tension in their body is like the tension of a spring. They're ready to spring. They're ready to leap. And they're ready and willing to fight. Okay, so that's one example. Fanon phrases this like, let's do this thing, when they hear that siren or hear the alarm coming from the military barracks. Okay, and of course, the idea is they're leading towards a kind of revolutionary war. Okay, and this is the last thing I'll say today. Fanon claims that what's behind all this initial stage of decolonization is a very simple set of demands. And things get more complicated later, but it's land, it's bread, and it's dignity. So the land and bread, I think, are pretty clear because it's just about resources and who controls them, and a poor population, a population which has been kept poor, wanting more material resources, more wealth. But this dignity part is also extremely important, Fanon says, because part of what the idea of species and biological race did was try and convince the colonized people, and maybe most of all the colonizers themselves, that the colonial society was justified, that there was a category of humans who were sub-persons and were not worthy of dignity, not worthy of respect. And that is exactly the dignity and respect that the masses among the colonized populations wants. That's exactly what is motivating them, in addition to these basic land and bread issues. So already in the earliest phases of decolonization, Fanon says, there's this claim about reclaiming one's humanity. I'm a human being. I'm an equal human to you, colonizer. Okay.